What if I told you that the seeds of World War II were planted not on a battlefield, but on Wall Street? The story you're about to hear connects a stock market crash to the rise of one of history's darkest regimes. This is the untold story of how economic catastrophe reshaped the world. The Great Depression began showing its first signs in the summer of 1929, months before Wall Street's infamous collapse on Black Tuesday, October 24, 1929, when prices started to decline. But the roots of this crisis ran much deeper, just like the 2008 global financial crisis. The First World War had disrupted the balance of supply and demand across numerous industries. For instance, when the Germans launched unrestricted submarine warfare during World War I, the United States and Britain made incredible investments in shipyard capacity to produce more ship tonnage than the Germans could sink. After the war, this massive capacity would suddenly become redundant. To give an example from the steel industry, while steel production in continental Europe declined due to severely damaged infrastructure after the war, the United States experienced an incredible surge in output during wartime. Naturally, as European industrialized nations began restoring their steel production and efficiency in the 1920s, overcapacity began emerging in this sector as well. We can observe the same effect across other industrial sectors of that era. The imbalance between agricultural production and demand was particularly massive by the late 1920s. As I mentioned in my previous videos, during the war years, the Germans had redirected synthetic fertilizer raw materials to war industry use to dramatically increase explosive production. While agricultural productivity declined in Germany and continental Europe, agricultural output increased substantially in Australia, Latin America, and North America. The Russian Empire, once a major agricultural power, saw its farming sector nearly collapse after World War I and the October Revolution of 1917. The communists' obsession with collectivizing agriculture would leave millions starving. In the 1920s, agriculture in continental Europe and the Soviet Union would recover much faster than industrial output. In the final quarter of the 1920s, the first parameter signaling the approach of the Great Depression would be the collapse in grain prices, whose supply had increased tremendously relative to demand. Among the causes of the Great Depression was another unexpected factor: advances in production techniques and technology. World War I had created extraordinary increases in production processes for automobiles, trucks, petroleum refining, chemical products, electrical goods, paints, pharmaceuticals, and the steel industry, while sectors like aviation were created from scratch. Improvements in production techniques increased output at lower costs while simultaneously creating downward pressure on prices. Moreover, this development would continue through the 1920s, with Ford's famous production techniques continuing to increase productivity and output across industry. The path to the Great Depression was also paved in the financial markets. At war's end, no country except the United States was in a position to return to the gold standard. All the systematic damage caused by the war had transformed into increased public debt and expanding money supply. Except for the United States, all developed and developing countries would engage in intense currency and cost competition, leading to significant financial stability problems. Germany's massive war reparations would be monetized through the Dawes Plan. The Germans would borrow from American banks to pay war reparation installments to the British and French, who would then service their debts to American creditors, to whom they had borrowed incredibly during the war. American banks would expand credit supply by opening new loans, and this phase of credit supply would flow toward investments targeting capacity increases worldwide. Note that major crises like Japan's 1990-1991 real estate and banking crisis, and the 2008 global financial crisis occurred when increasing credit volume created asset bubbles that subsequently burst. In the 1920s, monetary expansion was flowing toward agricultural and industrial capacity increases on one hand, while partly creating dangerous bubbles in capital markets. Meanwhile, the communists who seized power in Russia refused to pay debts equivalent to a massive 3.6 billion US dollars for that time, and nationalized the Baku oil fields, the world's most strategic oil field at the time, without compensation, adding insult to injury. Additionally, the Versailles system had created numerous young states in Central and Eastern Europe, whose very existence complicated the financial system and international payment system. The shift of the financial center from London to the less regulated New York would light the fuse of the financial bomb. Indeed, on Black Tuesday in 1929, the sudden collapse of the New York Stock Exchange burst the balloon-like inflated credits and stock prices, creating a major financial crisis that delivered the final blow to an economy already suffering from supply and demand imbalances. When the Federal Reserve insisted on remaining on the gold standard, the deepening of the crisis became inevitable. Staying on the gold standard to protect the American dollar's credibility was a fatal mistake. As investors competing to close highly leveraged positions in rapidly falling capital markets sold stocks and tried to repay their loans, credit volume and thus money supply contracted, while the Fed allowed money supply to contract by remaining on the gold standard. In a macroeconomic environment where the tremendous productivity increase of the 1920s had already pushed goods supply ahead of demand, the financial crisis that erupted would further magnify the macroeconomic imbalance. The real contraction in money supply in an environment of falling prices would cause prices to collapse.
The Fed had actually confused two concepts in 1929-1930. The increasing credit volume of the 1920s had turned around and created excess supply across all sectors. After Black Tuesday in 1929, the issue was no longer the bursting of bubbles created by credit growth. While panic-sold stocks created massive wealth losses, loans were being repaid through these sales. Rapidly closed positions and loans had created a liquidity trap or squeeze in the market. To break this trap, the Fed should have created money to ease the system, but by staying on the gold standard, it drove the final nail into the coffin. By remaining on the gold standard, Americans would cause another problem they hadn't considered. During this period, the gold standard linked numerous currencies worldwide at fixed parities. The collapse in American financial markets and the development of economic depression would spread throughout the world like a pandemic through the gold standard. This disease was a vicious cycle that could never be broken. Collapse in financial markets, intensive stock and asset sales, credit contraction, real money supply contraction, demand decline, price decline, capacity utilization decrease, unemployment increase, demand decline with increasing unemployment, price decline. During the worst period of the Great Depression, between 1929 and 1933, American industrial output contracted by exactly 47%, GDP by 30%, while unemployment rose above 20%. The unemployment figures were also deceptive because the number of those who lost their jobs and left their places of residence couldn't be fully counted. Prices fell by 1/3 during this period, and industrial facilities and centers that had made massive investments in the 1920s, far from covering their increasing fixed costs, fell into a terrible liquidity trap. Dear viewers, I would like to convey without changing a single comma how Ben Bernanke, who would later become Fed chairman in 2002, summarized the Fed's role in the Great Depression. "We did it. We're very sorry. We won't do it again." These were the exact words Ben Bernanke uttered on November 8, 2002, at the 90th birthday event of the famous economist, Professor Dr. Milton Friedman, regarding the Great Depression. In this speech, Bernanke would explain how the Fed's mistakes caused the worst economic crisis in United States history. The economic depression would be felt more delayed and somewhat milder in Britain and France, but these two major economies were already troubled even in the 1920s. The terrible damage caused by World War I was still on the backs of these two economies, and this damage had been attempted to be collected from Germany, the loser of the war, through war reparations, but very little of this damage had been collected. Besides the United States, the country hit hardest by the Great Depression was Germany. The country had achieved both economic and political stability in the second half of the 1920s under the leadership of Chancellor Gustav Stresemann, and Germany had returned to the international arena as a great power again. While Stresemann was gradually removing the constraints of the Versailles Order imposed on Germany, he was planning to settle accounts with Poland and Czechoslovakia when the time came. However, Stresemann's life would not be long enough to realize this ideal. In fact, the Germans had secretly violated the heaviest conditions of the Versailles Treaty, the abolition of the German General Staff system and the rule that Germany could not possess heavy weapons and combat aircraft. After 1919, the Germans had established a secret and shadow military command system. Germany was secretly rearming even immediately after Versailles. However, it was not yet possible for the German army to defy the Versailles system in the early 1930s. Stresemann's untimely death would create a huge vacuum in the German center-right. The Great Depression would affect Germany, a classically export-dependent economy, to the same extent as the United States. As all world economies raised tariff walls and shifted to protectionism, high unemployment and internal turmoil returned to Germany. The weakening of the moderate center-right would unexpectedly move the Nazi Party from marginality to mainstream politics. The Nazi Party, in other words, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, has an interesting history. The party was founded by Anton Drexler, a locksmith from Munich. Anton Drexler's basic political thesis was that Germany had actually lost World War I on the battlefield. Socialists, communists, and international Jewish organizations had stabbed Germany in the back by creating internal unrest. This fairy tale actually originated from the narratives put forward by Marshal Paul Vandenberg and General Erich Ludendorff, the military leaders of the 1916 to 1918 period, who were responsible for losing the war. This story, fabricated by Ludendorff and Hindenburg to save their own names, would become the belief of a portion of the German people bearing the pain and consequences of defeat. The Dolchstoß Legende, meaning the stab in the back legend, was the exact definition of this story. The Germans could not comprehend how the German armies, which had approached as far as Paris during this period, were defeated over 100 days during the July to November period of 1918. The internal unrest that broke out in the final days of the war and the subsequent civil war had caused this legend to spread. Moreover, when the Germans requested an armistice in November 1918, the enemy still had not entered German territory.
The only group that could explain the state of German armies in the second half of 1918 and how the war was definitively lost was the German General Staff. If the Germans had not requested an armistice in November 1918, Allied armies would most likely have crossed the Rhine River in 1919 and entered the Ruhr Valley, Germany's largest industrial center. Drexler's rhetoric was ultra-nationalist, anti-Semitic, and would also bring into the party a wealthy journalist named Dieter Eckart. A young man who caught Eckart's attention with his fiery speeches would, with Eckart's support, take over the party leadership. This young man's name was Adolf Hitler. Until Eckart's death in 1923, he was the figure who essentially created Hitler from top to bottom and laid the foundation of Nazi ideology. Hitler had been made a member of the party by a unit affiliated with the Freikorps, a right-wing paramilitary arm of the German army, to monitor what was happening in the party. However, because Drexler and Eckart's rhetoric aligned with Hitler's beliefs, the young man became genuinely devoted to the party and its cause. His hypnotic voice and speaking method would quickly propel him among the party's leadership. Drexler would be pushed aside in 1921, and Hitler would take over the party leadership.
Hitler created a top management consisting of his own friends in the party and made Eckart's worldview the party's fundamental constitution. The Nazis' 1923 government coup attempt in Bavaria would be easily suppressed, and Hitler and his associates would be arrested. During his brief imprisonment, Hitler would pen his work Mein Kampf, which would become the Nazi Party's future constitution. During the years 1924 to 1928, when Chancellor Gustav Stresemann stabilized Germany politically and economically and broke the first chains of Versailles, the Nazis presented the image of a marginal party that could only get 2.6 to 6.5% of the vote in 1924 to 1928, whose members fought in beer halls and streets and wore comical outfits. The Great Depression would provide the Nazis with a great opportunity. The party would receive 18.3% in September 1930, 37.3% in July 1932, 33.1% in November 1932, and 43.9% in March 1933, the Weimar Republic's last free election. Hitler's arch-enemy, the Communists, played a major role in his rise. In the 1930 elections, the Nazis and Communists together obtained 40% of the vote, and after this election, instead of supporting the mainstream bloc that had received 60% of the vote, the Communists continued their harsh opposition to the mainstream parties in power. Because the German Communist Party basically took its directives from Moscow, and Moscow defined German moderate right-wing mainstream politicians as capitalist dogs and the German Social Democratic Party as social fascists. Although the Nazis became the first party in 1932, they were still not in power. Everything would change when 22 businessmen penned a letter to President Paul von Hindenburg requesting that he appoint Hitler to the chancellorship. Hindenburg was 86 years old at this time and in poor health. Despite his role in losing the war, Hindenburg was an important figure in Germany and was known as the hero of Tannenberg. A Prussian marshal and member of an important Junker family, the German president viewed Hitler as a bohemian corporal and looked down on him. He thought he could control him by appointing him chancellor and surrounding him with moderate right-wing politicians. Moreover, the Weimar Republic's constitution contained a full semi-presidential system in which Hindenburg as president had extensive powers. After Hitler became chancellor on January 30, 1933, he used the Reichstag fire, which the Nazis had secretly started and blamed on the Communists, as a reason to get the elderly president to declare a state of emergency. Then, on March 23, 1933, the Enabling Act, which gave the government legislative power, was passed in the German parliament, the Reichstag, with 444 votes in favor and 93 against. Many deputies had not been allowed into parliament. The German center-right had supported the Nazis in the vote. In 2 months, Hitler had seized all the system's control mechanisms. Although it was the government that received the authority, Hitler would use it as chancellor. Hitler had decided that it was now necessary to eliminate the leaders of the paramilitary SA organization, which constituted the left wing of the Nazi Party. Approximately 1,000 people would be eliminated by the SS and Gestapo over 3 days in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. Hitler would also have his predecessor as chancellor, Kurt von Schleicher, assassinated. Hitler had killed 3 birds with 1 stone. He had eliminated the paramilitary force of the Nazi Party that was not fully under his control, gained the support of the German army, and purged the left wing within the party that could rival him. On August 1, 1934, information reached Hitler that the elderly president was about to die. Using his special legislative power, he issued a special law to merge the presidency and chancellorship to take effect upon the death of the current president. Hindenburg died the next day. This special law would be put to a referendum 2 weeks later and ratified with 89% of the vote. Hitler had now gained access to the presidential powers, the office that appoints and dismisses the prime minister, and had also become the commander-in-chief of the army. Ironically, he would renew the Enabling Act that gave him legislative power again in 1937 and 1941, because everything had to be legally proper. Hitler was now Germany's sole leader, but shaping the army's upper echelons would take until 1938. The international order was now about to collapse.
Hitler and the Nazis, after completely seizing power in Germany in 1934, would first change the Versailles Order and then the entire international order through bluffs and gambles. Hitler, a former street painter, would begin the poker game in 1935 and would leave the table on September 1st, 1939, by starting World War II. In our next video, we will tell you about this incredible poker game. From economic collapse to totalitarian takeover, the Great Depression didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed democracy itself. Hit subscribe to see how Hitler's poker game would plunge the world into its darkest hour. The next chapter of this story will shock you.